Okay, so we have a panel discussing the, relevance of betting in esports. Obviously, it's very well established in traditional sports markets, both in regulated and unregulated forms. And I guess the discussion here is to focus on, can esports betting be an added value to the ecosystem as a whole? So I guess just kind of to start things out, we already heard a little bit of the background of traditional sports betting in our previous presentation, but I think it bears repeating how traditional sports has handled betting, just to kind of give a little bit more of an overview. So Sang-in, can you maybe speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. I think the traditional sports used betting as an effective means of marketing, because betting makes people watch more games, pay more attention to their favorite sports, and spend more money in the industry. Without betting, I cannot even imagine that the viewership the traditional sports currently keeps. Sports betting has helped a lot the traditional sports in growing sharply. In a similar way, the esports betting will be able to help the esports ecosystem grow fast. If this is the case, what we need to successfully establish the betting system, I think there should be two major things: legalization of betting and esports data provided by IP holders. Most of you would agree with the first one, legalization. So what I want to talk about now is esports data provided by IP holders. Let's imagine that you are about to bet on something. You need to analyze and check out previous games, statistics, news, and scores to win. Then you need an access to those information, which is provided by a web or application services like op.gg, and op.gg needs an esports data API offered by IP holders. In the meantime, esports betting service providers also need esports data API to run their services in a streamlined way. So if IP holders develop and produce the esports data API in a systematic way, then both the esports betting users and providers can use more data, and thus the whole esports ecosystem will be abundant in a variety of betting systems.
Thank you very much. I think we discussed a little bit about the application of betting to esports, but maybe to discuss a little bit more about kind of the fundamentals and the way in which betting services do that. Maybe Victor, you can talk a little bit about, I guess, your experience in the many years that you've been involved in gambling, to talk about the data that you use there and how maybe you see that able to apply to esports as well.
Right, so the segue there is a little off, because I was in the poker industry,
okay,
which is different from sports betting. But you neighbor on the products of casino and sports betting with everything you do, because they come together as a package most of the time, depending on the market. I'd say, so I want to take one step back if I can, and say that gambling has existed whether we approve it or not, which is regulation, versus illegal, which we heard a lot about in Moritz' presentation, we should talk more about. It's existed as long as man has existed, with a way to communicate, whether you threw bones in a rudimentary bowl of some kind and see, do they come up or down, was it black, white? It's existed for as long as we've existed, and I don't think it's going away. Countries that embrace regulation, to segue back into that, they see a lot of tax coming in from it, and they become dependent on it. The downside of not regulating, and I'm not a passionate gambling guy. I represent esports entirely, but the negative consequences that spill over into esports is, if gambling is going to happen whether you want it or not, do you want a shadow community with high incentives for low-earning kids in the growth phase of esports? And that's been a major problem in Korea, especially for multiple reasons. Regulation, and the fact that StarCraft was a single-player game. Plus, people weren't making a lot of money. Like the top 10 players in StarCraft in Korea, and I was one of the first pros here, oddly enough, being a foreigner. I made good money. I made about $2,500 a month basic salary in '99. But most of my peers, the guys that were equally as good or even better in many cases, they made ramyun, a floor bed and computer time in a PC bang, and maybe travel money to a tournament against a 50% cut of, winning $1,000. One has to note also that for the foreigners that are in here, and maybe the Korean crowd that doesn't remember, you would earn maybe $600 to $800 a month on an unqualified job 6 days a week, right? So we're talking about people who are sensitive to a situation where they get on TV, there's betting action that is unregulated, uncontrolled, there are significant interests in who wins or loses, and if you can give that guy, a cut of some big action, you take $1 million handle, as we call it in sports betting, action, and maybe the margin is 10% on that, let's say, for simplicity. $100,000 is being won by someone or earned by someone. To share $1,000, which doubles that guy's revenue that month, it's pretty good deal. So one has to understand that. It's much harder to rig a game like soccer where you have so many moving players and pieces, and it's not guaranteed that you buy the goalie. Sweden didn't shoot we didn't shoot one shot on goal in the last 2 qualifier matches in World Cup, right? So, and that's across 180 minutes plus, right? So, but if you get a StarCraft player to allow someone to win, it's very easy. And that's the benefit of regulation. Moreover, it's happening regardless. And actually, from our perspective, and I could be wrong here, but the craziest betting action comes from the markets that don't allow it, ironically. So let some of that come into taxes, have responsibility on the operators, whether they are state or licensed by state, and addiction programs, these kind of community services that you can do. Education.
To follow up on this, I think the game developers and the IP holders, by suppressing or protecting themselves from betting, they're also enabling the illegal side of betting. Because if you help the regulators regulate the markets of betting, in the end, skin gambling would be different, or even like traditional betting, illegal betting would be different, would be protected, regulated. And it's very important, I think, from the game developers, from the IP holders, to move on those topics and don't forbid, per se, the betting, which can be a virtuous activity for esports. But if you don't do that, if you are protecting yourself from gambling, this is where the bad stuff happens, and that's what happened from CS:GO skin gambling, for example.
Yeah, I think you tapped on a key truth here that might be not directly intuitive, but we saw that in traditional sports, when they were newly exposed to betting, the first reaction is to shy away from the activity, like put your hand in the sand and pretend it's not happening. But ultimately what you do by that is you invite the risks that you're trying to protect yourself from, that are festering from mostly unregulated markets, as Victor said correctly. And we see that right now. I alluded to it briefly during the presentation. The people who actually do something, the rights holders who embrace it and deal with the topic and educate around the risks, are not the IP holders of the games. And I think I would really welcome a shift in the stance of the publishers in the years to come, and a more mature dealing with it. And as I mentioned earlier, if done right, it can be very beneficial and also commercially significant.
One of the things you mentioned, Sang-In, is the role in esports betting that the publishers, that data aggregation and analysis, how do you get the data that you use to bet on the games? a lot of times it either comes, as a lot of times it comes through like an API or through a way that people examine the data that comes from the games itself. So I guess all three of you, Flavie, Sangen, and Moritz, work at least in some way with ways of gathering data from esports, either live or after the fact, and aggregating that data. So maybe offer Flavie a chance to maybe talk a little bit about how that process works. Where do you see it going in the future, and how necessary that is towards betting in esports?
At Panda's core, we are pure data provider. So our only job is to collect data on the competitions. So it's only professional data. So the way we collect the data is we cannot connect to any developers, game developers, because they don't offer access for most of them. So we thought about technology to help us collecting the data. So we're using artificial intelligence to watch videos from YouTube, to watch live from Twitch. And this artificial intelligence is able to understand what's happening on the screen. So basically, when you're watching a game of Hearthstone, it's able to say which cards are on the board for a game of Counter-Strike, which players carry which weapons. This is all done automatically with technology. And this way, we can analyze any game and also any amount of games. So if we want to analyze 100 games at the same time, we're able to do so. It's very difficult at the moment to collect the data. A lot of game developers are afraid to share, and also it's not on their agenda actually. Because when you think about a game developer, they need to develop a good game. They have 5 years without having any player on the platform, any money, revenue coming. So they cannot be focused on building a data platform to share the data. It's complicated for them. And in the history of games, there is very few games that provide data themselves. So as a fact, they don't do it a lot. So we had to find different ways. In the future, I think more and more the game developers will think about this as something mandatory for them. Sharing data is part of developing the ecosystem. Everyone needs data actually in esports, so it's very important for them. But at the moment, it's a bit, it's not done actually.
Something I would like to add here is we look at an entirely digital sport, and you would think that there is no data abundance, but the reality is if we look at the data landscape in esports, it's very fragmented, and only a few stakeholders understand the value of it and invest in technology to extract it from the game servers. If there's no publisher-sided technology for it, otherwise the technology Flavien is alluding to, like optical character recognition, computer vision, is obviously a way to do it as well. An issue you run into with these often unofficial feeds is that they are subject to delays. And talking about betting, these delays, they are basically a challenge in the commercialization, because for betting data you need high speed. I mean, I would hope that in the future we can use more sophisticated methods, eliminate delays, and get more data points as the space is evolving.
So you mentioned that a lot of times there's not developer support for the data streams that you deem necessary towards moving this industry forward. What are the ways that you would, if you had every developer here, what do you tell them? In what ways do you convince developers to add this kind of support?
I mean, ultimately, I think if you provide them a business case that is appealing, they will probably look into it. The technology is definitely there in all of the games. It's just, is it available? Looking at the publishers, they have different profiles in their reluctance or their will to open the data to third parties. And again, I think there's a few things that are developing here. I'm not entirely sure where the bull share of the publishers is moving, but at the moment, it's a very protective policy around the data. But I think if we develop the right commercial setting, they will be interested. Ultimately, what everybody has to understand working in esports is for the game publisher, it's mainly a retention tool to their player base where they monetize very effectively. So I can understand if a publisher is not engaging with betting markets, because I don't want to risk my reputation on what for me is marketing spend to potentially have a negative impact on my franchise that has a player base with a big share of underage players as well. As we both, or all of us pretty much saw or said before, this is ultimately inviting the risks that they're trying to protect themselves from.
Can I present the philosophical dilemma? Imagine that whatever you think is being bet on, anything in the world, you take that out to 100x. It's now 50% of the money that we spend. Now make it all a shadow economy, all of it. And tell me that is a world that you want to live in. I don't think so. It would determine the outcome of everything in life, right? And if you think of it from that perspective, and you take it down a notch, you just say, this is happening, we can't stop it, no matter whether we support it or not. If we understand how the betting action actually works, so we understand who's betting, on what, where, when, and why, and we can analyze that data. And I'm not talking about me now, I'm talking about like as a collective. It doesn't matter what segment we're talking about, but specifically betting now, this applies to anything really. Then we can make educated decisions and we can understand what's going on. So in terms of if you're Blizzard Activision, if you're Riot, if you're Valve, you'll understand if this game was thrown or not. And that matters to you because esports matters to you. Whether you look at it as a retention tool, which you said, which is different from how soccer is played. It's not a retention tool. It's business, and the IP ownership is different, right? So that's a huge differentiator between sports and esports. I typically say the only difference, you move sports up the family tree and call it all sports. Then you have esports, electronic interface, physical sports, which is today what we refer to as sports per default. If someone can't get that, to compute because they're very sports-centric, thinking of it as a physical sport, add motorsports in the middle, and you'll have arguments that it's either mental or it's, it's a machine working for you or it's physical, right? And people will debate that. Mind sports, which is, a fraction of, it's something still. You can add various types of sports. It's really about the interface. If you get over the fact that it's not physical, it's just the interface. Now, I would like to live in the world where, because I'm esports-centric, right, where sports competitions are based on skill. You have performance-enhancing drugs that plague sports, physical sports. You have match fixing and other enhancement tools that plague esports. There is a common ground somewhere there. And so you don't have to do it for commercial reasons. And you may have to think about how you want to do that if you want to protect data, because there's some other, we could have a whole panel on, democratization of data and what that would do, because we know, we can look at physical sports and we can say, well, America has a fantastic infrastructure to support their athletes, from diet, from, all the support that you can get. A small country with no budget can't compete fairly in that system. The same is true for data and esports. I mean, if you have sophisticated data, you can model your training camp based on the opposition you're going to play in the future. And we talked about this a bit in prep. It's not part of the panel, but I mean, you'll have an AI that is trained on your opponent's data. So now you come down to, and this is, who owns the data, who owns the AI, who controls the world, right? Small ecosystem, big ecosystem. Well, Elon Musk's approach is everyone should have access to AI rather than a few corporations or countries having access for this to be benign, right? It's on a smaller scale, and we're talking world, and I'm drifting off. Part of that is jet lag. But in a smaller version of it, publishers can decide, do we want everyone to have fair access to data, so that literally I can start a grassroots team, Moritz can have a well-funded team, and we're not worlds apart per default just because of money and the tools. So data has more applications, and of course publishers are interested, they're concerned. Some of them will like the zeros that the gambling industry can bring them in terms of cash value. Maybe not the three big powerhouses in esports at the moment. Again, Riot, Valve, and Blizzard Activision. But the next company that comes up, say Psyonix and Rocket League, they might be. It might, be a valuable financial asset for them to be able to sell that data, but at the same time get data integrity. Because what these guys do, besides making money on, the gambling action, and is of course they care about whether a match has integrity or not. because the whole business model falls otherwise, right?
I mean, I'm happy to give a brief example on these integrity risks Victor's alluding to. Like the anatomy of a fixed match, how this kind of works. I think as a federation, you would have an inherent interest in kind of understanding the workings of this. This has been the major reason why skin gambling was such a problem. When I say we distribute data to regulated betting, we do this for high-profile events where we are confident that the incentive for the teams participating to win the match and play fair and compete is significantly bigger than a potential gain on a betting market. And this paradigm was absolutely thrown off in skin gambling. So many of the matches we reported on, where we analyzed the liquidity, we saw, I can actually say a name here. It was like, later it was public. There was a Mixed Sport Pro League Invitational, a very small competition. And a Chinese team played an Indian team in the group stage of the tournament. The winner of the tournament would get, I think, $500. It was played in Counter-Strike. Tai Lu, a world-class team, was competing there as well. Arguably, none of the teams really had a shot. It was a group stage match, but it had six-figure liquidity in skins. And this, it just shows you the balance here is off, and this is creating problems. Then we saw incredible patterns in the liquidity that were really suspicious. And later, we also found out that one of the players was betting against himself. In this tournament, they didn't even impose rules that betting on the match by participants is not allowed. So, I mentioned earlier the educational piece is important. So, if the structure and the right code of conduct is not imposed by the organization, we have a really, from a litigation standpoint later, a very hard time of tackling this issue. We can monitor as much as we want. So this is one of the problems that we had in skin gambling. And this is also a problem you have when very low tier, very grassroots competitions are exposed to betting. This is the kind of interaction that is usually inviting risks rather than furthering growth. And it's important that this line here is respected.
So to speak a little bit about some of the, possible issues that can be incurred by esports betting. I know you mentioned a few of them, and all of those seem to be directly related to unregulated betting markets. So how do you take something that is as large as the unregulated side of betting and transition that into regulated? We've talked about both of those being categories, but how do you make the transition between them?
Well, obviously there are legal structures stemming from an established regulated sports betting industry that can be applied. The reason skin gambling exploded is because they didn't impose any player registration. Anybody could sign off with their Steam ID, deposit their skins, bet. So usually you have to go through a process that is known as a KYC action, so know your customer procedure, where you make sure the guy is of legal age for betting in whatever jurisdiction. The payment has to be validated. This is usually FCA approved or the whatever respective financial authority in the jurisdiction we're talking about. So there's a process to do it right. And the regulated market and the adoption of esports betting is a model that, in my opinion, works and is not inviting these risks. In the case of skin gambling, Valve could have a stronger stance, and they should have, in my opinion, and put an end to it, because they definitely have the tools to do that. The other unregulated part is we had an incident with BB Young and Live in Korea last year, to world-class StarCraft players. They threw matches for, I think in the end, a total 2 matches were thrown for $65,000. If you re-engineer basically this sum that was valuable for someone to spend on fixing the match, it gives you an idea how much liquidity was wagered in the background. And this was done on unregulated sites, so that was without any oversight and closed from any effective monitoring. So these incidents, they ripple through esports as a whole, and the damages that these especially the damage this match fixing has ranges beyond the players and the teams that are directly involved in it. It tarnishes the reputation of the entire sport, and in the case of esports, the entirety of esports. Blizzard Activision is probably really mad that Valve messed up skin gambling so much, because people thought, oh wow, people bet on computer games, kids bet on computer games with in-game items, and it probably had a negative effect publicly to them as well, even though we weren't involved. So yeah, sorry, I diverged a bit from your question here, but that's our view on these things.
So then, Victor, since you're coming from more of an esports standpoint, looking then towards the inclusion of gambling into the position that you're coming from, what would you say are some of the, I guess not only like benefits, but where do you see the I guess future of gambling in esports? Is it going to be is it going to continue to be something that is I don't know, distant or at least distant in the approved market for gambling, or is it going to continue to have this large black sector?
Okay, so again, I go back to sports, esports, physical sport, same premise, different interface. Therefore, every jurisdiction that already has sports regulation has esports regulation. They may or may not give people, athletes visa yet. I mean, America does, and that's a strong sign. Anything America does, smaller countries will also copy and say, well, hey, if they do it, there's something to it, right? And I would be more concerned if America said, nope, we're not going to do it, right? So actually, it's coming everywhere. Some countries are at the forefront. Some countries are looking at it. I mean, I'm half-time based in Malta, which is a tiny island between Sicily and North Africa. It's totally okay not to know where that is. I mean, they're looking at it, but they don't understand it entirely, right? So it's different level of maturity everywhere. For all intents and purposes, it's going to be regulated the same way. It should be regulated the same way. In terms of athletes' bodies, which is the context that we're here with IeSF, like Jan, I think it was Jan on the panel yesterday, he was saying that it might be different, it might be better, right?
He had a great quote.
Sorry?
He had that great quote by Reagan.
So I'm saying, we'll see where the regulation side of the sport itself comes. I mean, IeSF is, it's going after esports as a whole concept, right? I don't know what I'm here to learn, actually. I don't know what the plan is, but within sports, you can't have one organization, as far as I'm aware, that covers tennis, soccer, American football, and everything else, because you have regional differences. You have, these are massive ecosystems on their own, split down into different compartments. Right now, it's not settled which esports are going to be forever. Maybe none of them are. And it's a much more fluid space, because it's hard to invent and build the infrastructure for a physical sport and take over the world. Conquer soccer, imagine that. I think you'd be crazy. You'd be seen as crazy if you said, I have an idea on how we're going to make a better physical sport. But everyone in this room understands we can't take for granted League of Legends, this sport or that sport in esports is going to be the #1 tomorrow. So there's more fluid space. Rotating back to your question, because it's equal, yeah, it's equal. I can't tell you what Korea is going to do, but I can tell you what I think they should do. My limited knowledge from having asked some people here, and so I'm basing it on secondhand information, I haven't verified this myself, is I think it was Moritz who told me the way the tax system works here. Again, we could be missing something. We don't speak the language fluently. If you tax the end user, in other words, you then create worse odds for them. So the illegal betting market gets an advantage. I can give you 2 times the money illegally on betting on a team, and the government is giving you 1.5 because it's taxing the odds at the user rate. Where you should be taxing is at the top. If you generate $100 million of revenue in whatever time span, you tax that from the operational side, whether it's licensed operators or state operators. If you implement the tax regime wrong, then it won't be competitive. You got to be competitive, so you got to get on the premium level of this. But there's plenty of conferences, plenty of forums where ideas are exchanged. Just go there and learn. It's that simple. You have a huge incentive to regulate it for all the other reasons that we mentioned. We could probably speak about that for a whole conference. It's here to stay. It's going to grow. It's going to grow with the sport. You know, I'm very hawkish on this. I knew the moment I landed in Korea 20 years ago, basically, that this would be the next worldwide phenomenon. It would be the biggest barrier that I saw from a Swedish perspective was stigmatization. I had a theory before I came here. When I saw people have dates in PC banks, PC rooms, internet cafes, I realized, there's no real reason why not everyone should be a gamer or would be a gamer if the stigma is gone. So, you know, Korea's way ahead on that. Clear to me that kids are going to be multi-sports practitioners on a casual and basic level by the time they're 6 years old in esports. They're all going to play games by the time they're 6. You may not have tried hockey, American football, baseball, basketball by that time in any kind of organized fashion. The arena is in your living room. It may be in your brain in the future if it gets integrated enough, right? Ice hockey, I have a hard time seeing grow worldwide, right? The climate's getting warmer, it's quite expensive. Huh?
Ice hockey is absolutely not growing.
No, and I'm saying if it's not growing now, it's going to be even harder in the future. So that's where the future is. Look at what's good and bad about sports and model from there. And that goes for regulation on esports too, or betting.
I think it's pretty obvious that it's necessary that esports need to be regulated, that we all agree on. And it's going to be that way. Like, you think about UK Gambling Commission, they regulated esports, but also regulated the skin gambling. And they want to protect it because it's very important. So I think the conclusion, we have to see also the positive aspect of it. Betting in an ecosystem like esports is very virtuous if it's done the right way. We talk a bit about sponsoring. At the moment in esports, the sponsoring are quite coming a lot from non-endemic. And betting is it could be a very high source of sponsoring. We think about Betway, which is one of the big bookmaker in esports in Europe. They're doing sponsoring the right way, with Ninjas in Pyjamas, for example. This is going a lot of money into the field. And when we think about the issue, which is match fixing, or one of the biggest issues is match fixing is also a consequence of low salary from the players. And at some point, the revenue from the sponsoring of bookmakers, it's coming to increase the average revenue of the players. It's just virtuous on all senses. Even like the tournaments organizers, if they get sponsoring revenue from the bookmakers, not only them, but if it's added, they also have more staff to protect the players, to teach them about, no, match fixing is not good. You have to teach those to the young players. The stakes are higher, the revenue are higher, the mindsets are more sane, and it's just going to be just an ecosystem, a sane ecosystem as a whole. It's very important, like, regulation is the most important thing, and you need to endorse betting, because if it's not done the right way, it's going to be like it was, skin gambling and everything.
And I realize I've been sounding very positive towards gambling on this panel, but actually, if you ask me, the honest truth is, I don't really like gambling. Part of me wishes that casinos didn't exist. You know, I've made money in the industry, especially on peer-to-peer side, which is poker. A sportsbook or a casino is designed to take your money in the long run, right? Otherwise, it can't function. Whereas poker is based around the fact that we sit at the table and we play. They take a fee, but it's peer-to-peer, right? So it's slightly different in my mind. That said, nothing I say or do is going to change the fact that gambling, like I said, is very human. So it's better we recognize that it's there, try to minimize the negatives, have an honest discussion about it, and be smart about it. Whether we are publishers, governments, society, any kind of operator.
One of the points you said earlier about the taxation and the regulation, I want to add a bit more context there, because we discussed that in our prep. The regulation is important, but I can give you an example where an attempt of an adoption of existing regulation to esports actually resulted in a bad consequence. Or I'll lead with an example from the sports world. What Victor was pointing at is that if regulation is imposed in the wrong way, in the regulated market, which obviously would underlie the regulation imposed, sorry for doing this, it can make the people who try to operate under this regime, it can give them an unfair advantage in the marketplace and ultimately leverage unregulated entities trying to get into this. And an example here is France. The government is taxing gambling turnover very high. And ultimately what happens is the people don't wager with the official French books a lot unless they have no other options. They try to go to other operators who are in a gray area operating in France because they underlie different taxation and can offer better services and better prices to their customers. So there is a risk in regulating it in the wrong way. They probably had in mind, oh, we want to regulate it, we want to make it good and create like a framework in which it can exist and leverage the sport. Ultimately, what they did is create one where the national endemic stakeholders are suffering and therefore are not investing as much as companies from another sphere. So, as I mentioned before, I worked with the UK Gambling Commission and it was very educational at the time because we were the first company to get a license for esports. But we didn't get an esports license, we got a sports betting license. It was just applying the existing regulation in the right way. So I don't think we need to go ahead and tailor something completely new. I think we need to take principles that work, that have been proven in traditional sports, and apply them in the right way.
So the principles that have been applied to traditional sports, you mentioned applying them in the right way. What would you say like the right way would be in your understanding?
Flavie mentioned this, education. We do workshops with teams, with the leagues that we work together. Some of them I conduct myself. I sit down and I explain to them the size of the market, what is unregulated, what is regulated, and we walk them through the risks of match fixing and how some players are sometimes drawn into this ecosystem and they don't realize it and they don't understand how to protect themselves. To give you an example, let's say a guy, a football player, they're training. One guy injures his foot during training, and one of his teammates walks out of the training, and the guy in the parking lot is asking him, hey, how's that foot of your colleague looking? Do you think he'll play next weekend? And he's like, oh no, the foot is broken, this guy's done for. The guy goes away with this critical information, makes a killing on the betting market because he has this insider info, and next week he goes back to the player and hands him $5,000. Look, this is your share, and you will give me more information every week from now on, or will expose that you helped me to make money with betting. So where does this player go to? It's like really understanding that match fixing is driven by individuals with criminal energy who really try to create a dependency here and throw these players into misery and try to have pressure points where they can work them. So educating the players around the risks here is a thing we do. So this is something we do in traditional sports that we apply. Then the monitoring is something that works one-to-one, except for that we expanded our operations to skin economies as well. And then lastly, applying it in the right way means like, it means sitting down and trying to understand how these games work and apply rules. So many of the competition organizers are doing a good job of that already, trying to protect the players and trying to format competitions in a way where they don't run risks of inviting integrity issues.
So, sorry, can I ask you, are you saying that there's a gateway sort of from giving some advice to eventually maybe getting in the back door and that transitions into some level of match fixing which can escalate all the way?
That is a gateway, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
That is one gateway. Again, tapping back into skin gambling, it was on a whole different level. We analyze these players and we can see their Steam IDs and we can see who's in their friend list. And we also know the IDs from high rollers on these skin gambling sites. The kind of connections that you have between professional athletes and people betting on these unregulated markets, they have been so visible, so obvious. This would never be accepted in traditional sports. So increasing the professionalism here and imposing the right code of conduct, I think, goes a long way. I think education is the key in solving this issue.
I'm glad you pointed out education kind of being the key there. I know last year we had a presentation by CASPA. The theme of last year's summit was protecting players, and that kind of education is very key. I had a presentation by CASPA just outlining kind of some of their advice and some of the education that they had given players there. So it's definitely being implemented. So I'm glad that you supported that as kind of the effort that needs to be done, even as a conversation to be had before full recognition of this regulated gambling aspect of esports. So it's definitely out there.
Yeah, I think the unregulated market is not going to go away. But this is a situation, this is a problem or challenge that is solvable. And I think equipping the players with the knowledge and the right tools and the right conduct to deal with it helps. And on the other side, some of the measures we do, or we also work with federations to a big extent to help them monitor markets and understand how they work, is probably a good first step.
All right, so we've talked pretty extensively. Victor, did you have something to add?
No, I just want to say, just imagine a scenario where you go to a regulated bettor. I don't know, which countries you all are from. It's very varied. I know a lot of Asian countries prohibit gambling, but where I'm from, if I go to the state-sanctioned place to bet soccer, I never bet, by the way, but if I were, they're not going to give me a credit. But if I go to an underground source, they might give me a $10,000 credit. Now that may be a torpedo collecting from you eventually, or shaking you down, right? That's the kind of shit. We gotta understand this really is a problem, not just esports but sports. Why not regulate it? Get it visible. Outcompete these guys on a fair basis, where you can use your Visa card instead of you having to deal with cash or credit systems. Maybe extortion as such, because their margins are much higher. So the profit, the margins will be higher because they have no competition, right? Fix it. There's all the incentive in the world. No shortage of finding reasons to do that.
I mean, this is definitely happening.
Yeah. No, it is. I know.
No. I mean, there is a framework that works. The competitive advantage of the unregulated market is it depends on where you go.
Of course.
But one solution to the problem is, and it is a big part of my agenda to unfold this potential here, is creating the best quality service on the regulated side to ultimately draw people there, which will also be a driver, I think, leveraging the transition from unregulated to regulated markets in the future.
All right, so we've talked about some of the challenges to deal with. As we close out the panel, I think it's important to highlight some of the benefits of, or at least the proposed benefits of increasing the regulated sector and even just the overall inclusion of betting in esports. And since so many of you are data analysts or have that as a major factor of your platforms, what if the regulated side of betting is to be increased, then you would like to see data analytics or APIs for all of these esports games be released, or at least more open to all of you. So we had a conversation in some of our pre-meetings about some of the other additional benefits of opening up data to teams. And while that's not necessarily directly related to the application of gambling, it is very interesting. And as we close things down, I think it's kind of worth kind of touching on maybe a side effect of increasing that availability of data.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sure. Oh, go ahead.
I think high data availability is about the ecosystem, and when you think about the ecosystem, you think about all the kind of businesses that needs data. We have here businesses that are fed with data, all four of us. So you have media, journalists, they use data to analyze games, apps, score apps, they use data. When you think about coaches, professional players, they need data. For OPGG is a very good example also. It's about data for the casual gamers. And I think every League of Legends player has used at some point OPGG. So it's every kind of business in the ecosystem, and in the traditional sports is exactly the same. It's all about the data and having the access and having the empowerment as a fan to access the data. And when you think about the esports fan, they are born into statistics. They're born into score. And giving them the data, when you do betting and you have more statistics to do smart bets, it's even better for a punter. And it's all about statistics for the ecosystem, and it's just that's the way you build something that match the values of esports, which are real-time, interactivity. It's all about statistics in the end. So we need to have those available, I think.
I just want to throw another potential solution in, though, because I take an esports-centric approach. I'm not in the gambling business. You could also imagine that publishers say, well, okay, we don't really want to give away all this data open to the market for X reasons. I know of some, that's a panel on its own. However, they could also cooperate. I mean, Valve, Blizzard, and Riot, as fierce of enemies as they are in the competitive market, they could just say, listen, let's set up something here where we handle integrity ourselves. The betting industry would benefit from that. Esports certainly would. The stakeholders, that is the publishers that obviously make the most money out of the ecosystem, not players, not teams, but they are the real stakeholders. They could do that for the integrity of their own thing. They can do it for their own titles, or they can collaborate on doing that on a bigger scale, and they would be, what, 80% of the market, you know, something such, give or take. It doesn't have to be the corporate commercial entities, and if data is the key part, try to figure out a way where you set it up separately. I mean, there's many ways to it. There's just, I think there's an El Dorado on the other side for the prosperity of esports, and that's good. So the conversation is good to have.
Yeah, I agree. They should totally do it. It's a trend we would welcome very much. You mentioned additional benefits that can bring to us. We developed our predictive platform with a commercial driver of serving the regulated betting market. But ultimately, me as an esports guy, I think the really cool applications are the ones we're exploring now and we're continuing to develop, where we can use these predictive parameters for teams to assess their decision making, to use it for coaching, to give it to fans. As Flavien said, this is the sports trend. The digitalization of sports is leveraging this increased data engagement. People want to know everything. Like we work with the AFL, Australian Football League, and we get like the health data from the players in real time from the match, and the coaches use it to understand how many sprints this one guy still has in him, and when he's going to exchange him. And fans love to see that stuff. It's connecting them more with the games they love and with the players and the professionals that they follow. And I think I hope to be in a position where we can do more of these cool things in the future. And I think listening to a few people yesterday on the panel, they all said we would love to have more consolidated data, and I think that's a problem, especially, okay, all four of us actually are trying to solve, to give people insights into performance of teams and players across any competition, if they work together or not. And that's definitely a benefit. And if you understand the ecosystem, you will see that investments into this technology, they need to have a connection to a commercial driver, otherwise people can't justify putting so much resources behind it. But ultimately, I think this leveraging a trend with more data that ultimately improves our ecosystem as a whole, and the experience for the people who leverage it, which are the fans at the end.
Although I would argue that the publishers do have financial interest, if they really think about it properly, to maybe even collaborate on it. They just need the integrity problem solved, but to their benefit, guys like you can do it for them.
We are trying to. To be really honest with you, the revenues that would be in it for the publishers are just not significant for them compared to what they make on the player base.
No, but
that's one problem we have.
Yeah, I know. You can't pay Blizzard enough to get their attention if they've decided it's not in their company structure.
But we can solve the integrity thing.
Exactly.
We're doing that.
But I'm also saying,
without working with them officially.
Yes, but if the publisher thought about it properly, they would invest more brain power in thinking about how can we solve integrity in the best way, and the solution may be to empower you guys more. It may be that they collaborate with their fierce competitors. It may be that they solve it for their own games. But there is a solution, and we are going to have an ongoing conversation about this, I'm sure, in the entire ecosystem.
The conversation is going to have to be ongoing after this panel, which is kind of drawing to a close. So I'd like to go ahead and open up some question and answer opportunities to our audience. You've been very attentive, and so I'd like to ask you to go ahead and raise your hands if you have a question, and we'll get a microphone run out to you very quickly. Can't see behind my podium, but are there any questions? Thank you, right up front.
Hi. When you speak about regulating the betting, and with the craziness rise of the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum, and because it's a peer-to-peer anonymous transaction, how does it come, what kind of side effect it will have on regulating esport betting?
Massive challenge, not to esports, but also to sports as a whole. There are a lot of crypto betting operators, and the anonymity, the anonymous flair that cryptos have, they tend to, make the KYC part harder. So I'm not saying you can't do crypto betting in the right way by just integrating it as a payment option like a Visa or something else that is established. But ultimately, it's just an additional layer that adds complexity there. And then if we talk about esports and crypto and betting, we look at three things that are hardly properly regulated as it stands. So obviously there's a lot of stuff going on.
Just to follow up, cryptocurrency are not anonymous, except some like Monero or others. But like Bitcoin, it's just you don't know who has this Bitcoin address, Bitcoin wallet. And when you think about Unicorn, for example, a bookmaker, pure player in esport, they've done their own ICO, they've done their own crypto, so they know exactly who has which wallets. So it's not anonymous. They know exactly who was betting on the platform. They have the names, they have the ages, they have everything they want to have. So it can be misused, but it's not perfectly anonymous. So the bookmakers, they have to handle it properly. If they don't, it's going to be a mess.
Yes, but you have both. And actually, I restrain myself from even mentioning Bitcoin because it can take over the whole. That's plenty of conferences. But having said that it's a challenge not just for sports betting. It's a global challenge in general, how money moves, right? Because if it is anonymous, you're talking about regulated sports books that then imply KYC, know your customer, which is you deposited $100, I let you play on my service. I don't actually take it out of your account. Many people don't know that. You think you have $100 that I took from you, but I'm just sort of holding it, the right to it. But then you want to withdraw your 150. If you lose it into the system, different operators handle it differently. But at that point, I ask you, can I have your address? Can I have your ID? A copy of your utility bill. This is something we don't do at all in esports. Valve doesn't know who anyone but their top players are. How would they know on Steam? Well, your credit card information. But if I set up a skin betting operation and I allow you to trade skins with my services middle hand for Moritz, for all I know, it's one of the other panelists. I mean, you don't keep track of age or anything of the sort because they know your customer thing is not integrated to it. I'm not saying we should go that route in all of, that might actually be a problem for Valve legally. They have legal cases against them for the skin stuff. But if we go back to Bitcoin, that is a problem in the entire Bitcoin market, whether you talk about ICOs and other things in that space, right? And that is something that no country has solved yet. And it's coming so fast that it's, I can see going multiple ways. But for either we will disrupt everything we know about economy entirely, or someone's going to try to put a lid on it, and probably with clumsy regulations, and some people are going to be caught and squeezed in between. As far as operations go, Malta, again, is a nation that prides itself on legal gambling, right? You have to know who your customer is. So if a customer wants to be anonymous, he's probably going to go to one of these underground services. The same thing that happens with cash. You have a betting shop somewhere in Seoul, regulated. I don't go there because someone else has a competitive advantage. That could be on an anonymity side. You just change one problem for another.
If you want to see a successful adoption of crypto to esports betting, definitely look at Unicorn. I mean, first of all, they're a partner, so advertising in their name, but they had a widely successful ICO, and they are coding their own crypto wallet, which is solving this problem of player identification. And I think it will work out. I think this is rolling out as we speak. So it's pretty exciting. I love that esports has this affinity towards new technology all the time. And I think this is what will keep us innovating in the future.
I mean, the problem is you cannot do taxing on cryptocurrency.
You
which
can.
Might be.
You can. Why not? If you have to register your bitcoins with your government, why couldn't they tax you? But then it's just become another fiat currency, right? And not what the diehard blockchain people are interested in, it becoming free movement. But it's also closely related to the darker side of the web, right? Illegal services, drugs, trafficking, guns, and so on, right? So it will be regulated, or it will completely overthrow everything that we think that we know about economies. Those are the two options, right? And when it gets regulated, who regulates it? How do they regulate? A lot of people are thinking about it and talking about it, but here's another issue with it, right? Governments move slowly in general, and this requires a technocratic approach. How do you get that competence? How do you, in time to catch the snowball? Maybe you don't. That's how we can disrupt world markets, but now we're going into something completely else.
Sorry, I just have last question. Who actually owns the data? Like, is it the player who you are pulling the statistics from, or is it the league who is playing in it, or it's the data company who's doing all the mathematics and artificial intelligence behind it? Who actually should own the data, or it's the publisher?
I think the technology companies don't naturally own the data unless they acquire rights, which is what we do in the course of our partnerships. The rights are with the competition operator at the moment. There is a potential there that the game publisher has also rights to this data. I think it's a few questions that haven't really been answered. For now, we have a good idea of how it is and a clear way to work together with rights holders.
Even in sport, it's a weird topic. Even in traditional sport, it's not well established. We really own the figure, like it's a statistic. Who scored the goal? Nobody owns exactly who scored the goal. The information is not owned. It's a bit complicated topic.
I think it's like websites. If I have a business consumer website, which I happen to do, and I present statistics, you can come in as a user, and I welcome you to come and visit my site and generate a page view or 10, looking for data on teams. That's 95% of what we do is data-driven. We do it differently than these guys. They have various levels of sophistication. We still do it 24/7 manual with real people inputting data, but we also we don't care so much about who's going to have the next free kick or whatever equivalent in esports. That said, I mean, if you extract it from the TV, it's public domain, right? If you extract it from the server, well, if you did it legitimately and there's something in the license that gave you access, then technically it belongs to the IP holder, right? So as long as it's visible on the outside. So if you come in and you scrape me, technically that's illegal. It's just very hard to enforce. You could do it from Nigeria for all I know, like a fake IP, right? And this happens. Actually, a lot of traffic that hits most websites that are data-driven is going to be bots and scrapers. Whether it's, I own the data that I collected, but if you can view it from the outside, I can't ever enforce it.
Yeah, if you create an exclusive vertical that has a different quality level, we tapped upon this earlier. I mean, I agree with Flavie, no one can own this information, but someone can own a superior mode of extracting the data, which creates a faster, more quality feed. So when we talk about data rights, this is the stuff that we need to drive like really sophisticated technology and our platform.
I can actually answer a different question as well. If you put a team logo on a website, you don't have the right to that unless they give you a release form, right? But you can talk about Liverpool or Manchester United in just plain text, because it's public information. It's similar, really, when it comes to data, I would say. What you couldn't have gotten, you got illegitimately. What you can get is free public information.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any other questions in the audience? All right, I think one right over here.
Thank you very much for the fantastic presentation and for all your hard work to maintain the integrity of the betting world and to try to make that little circle a lot bigger in comparison to the gray or the black betting that exists already. So my question is, it's been interesting to watch your presentation. I have some experience in the field through the integrity programs that we ran for international federations of traditional sport. And I know that majority of regulators throughout the world have a clear stance or position about how they view sports betting. Now, in those territories, is esports considered part of the family and can be bet on with simple or more complex instruments? Or is it a process of accepting by the Ministry of Sport, meaning the government, the recognition of esports as a sport, which is the endeavor of the IeSF today, in order to be under the same blanket? That's question one, if it can be under the same blanket or it is already. And question two is, is it good for esports to be in the same blanket as traditional sports, since the complexity of the game that exists, especially if publishers are releasing you data, you can make amazing instruments and observers have viewer points where traditional sports can never put that many cameras on a field of play?
Well, so we have to go like jurisdiction by jurisdiction with this one, to be honest. I can give an example in Germany. It's not recognized as a sport. The only difference we see is in the taxation. Sports are taxed with 5% turnover, and esports is not a sport, so technically it would be taxed differently. This is creating challenges. Otherwise, would it have to be on the same blanket? I think where it makes sense, yeah, but this is a really complicated topic, okay? And there's a lot of different approaches by different governing bodies. I think we shouldn't, if it's not necessary, go ahead and create and tailor esports-specific regulation, because a lot of things can go wrong when people look at the games and don't understand them and potentially impose rules that harm the ecosystem as a whole.
It is and isn't, I would say. So in Korea, for example, my understanding, and I could be wrong here, is that you can go into a legally government-regulated place, but they choose what they add. So if they haven't added political betting, which is an example I'll give you of why it falls under sports betting. If you're going to do Trump election back in 2016, you're going to lose a lot of money as a sports book, and they did. But having said that, you can bet on reality shows, you can bet on a bunch of different things. Esports is no different, so it's treated under sports betting everywhere where it's regulated. Where it's gray, it's also gray, right? And where it's government controlled, the government might impose, no, you can't bet on this product. I mean, I would imagine, just a guess, that if they didn't include esports, there are some sports that they don't cover. They probably don't have paddle tennis, which is growing fast in Europe. They may or may not have UFC. Actually, UFC is probably decently big here now. But you know what I mean? Like, it depends on who controls it. If it's up to the sports book, and there's a blanket regulation that they follow, those regulators sort of understand these things. It took them a little bit of time because there was a confusion between esports being a game, right? A lot of comparisons were done with poker. The typical thing in poker is I spend $100 on entering a tournament, and then we all pool the $100 together, 10,000 people, and in the end someone wins a large chunk of that, like 30% of the prize pool that we community put. But you have a chess problem when it comes to esports, and this is just a skill game gap of knowledge for some of these places. But I didn't see any regulation come out. I saw talks, and I was concerned for a while that they thought of it as a participatory thing where you put in an entry fee, and then you win your prize pool based on that. But because it's sponsor-driven, you have to look at it as like golf, tennis, right? There may be a participation fee actually in tennis, but most of it comes from the ecosystem itself. I'm slightly ignorant when it comes to the details of tennis, I have to admit. But yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I think that is going to conclude our time for our questions and answer and for our panel. So if you could please give our panelists a big round of applause.